All right, so the first two tasks of the exercise were meant to catch you up to the state of our code after you watched me make those changes in the previous video. So in our first task, we were asked to delete this block of log messages. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. Nice, easy. And our next task is to modify the activity_numbers.xml to change it to use a linear layout instead of a relative layout, as well as change its orientation to vertical. And then also add a view ID, which I'm going to call root view. Great, so those are our first two tasks. So for the third task, we need to modify the onCreate method in the numbers activity. We need to modify it so that it uses a while loop to create a text view for each element in the words list, and then displays the text view on the screen. So here's a version of the numbers activity.java that we've posted online. And the code that it uses here to create the three text views as a manual approach rather than using the while loop approach. So after studying this code and understanding how it works, it will help us to write the while loop. Now, before we begin writing the while loop, let's review the three guiding questions that we discussed earlier in the while loop lecture. All right, so now let's discuss how to add text views to the screen using the while loop more in depth. And remember, this is the general structure for how we're going to write our while loop. And the three questions that we'll talk about will help us fill in these boxes. So what task do we want to do each time? Well, from the numbers activity code, it looks like we want to create a new text view, then set the text view to a single word in the list, and then add the text view to the root view. Second, so how many times do we want to repeat this loop? In this example, we want to repeat it 10 times. So one iteration per word in the list. And there are 10 words in this list right now. The third question is, what is the condition? Well, we want to keep iterating through the list until we reach the end of it. So if we create an index variable to keep track of our current index position, our condition can be to keep looping until the index variable is less than 10, which is currently the length of the words list. So this assumes that the index variable starts at 0 and then increments by 1 each time. All right, so I'm back here in the numbers activity.java, the version where we've created text views doing the manual way. So I'm going to copy and paste this block of code that allows us to do that. And now in Android Studio, in the numbers activity.java, in the onCreate method, I'm going to add that block of code. Now remember what we did here was first we found the root view for the whole layout. Then we created a variable to keep track of the current index position in the words array list. And then we created new text views to display each of those words and added those text views to our root view to be displayed. But this was a pretty manual approach. So let's take a look at how to change it to a while loop. Well, starting with this first line of finding the root view for the whole layout, we do want to keep that. That will stay here even with using our while loop. Now next comes the parts of the while loop. So I will write that out here. Remember that the while loop requires setting up the counter variable. Then comes the while keyword, and inside's the condition, followed by the braces. And inside these braces contain the instructions or tasks, as well as updating the counter variable. So here's a setup of our while loop. So the first thing we need to do is to set up the counter variable. And it looks like we actually did that down here. So I'm going to take that piece of code and substitute it in here. Now next we have the while keyword, followed by the parentheses. And inside we have the test condition. And remember that our test condition is that we need the index variable to be less than 10 in order to continue this while loop. However, instead of using 10 explicitly, I'm going to use words.size method. That way, if the words list ever does change, we won't need to update the test condition here. It would allow us to automatically get to the end of the list, no matter how long it is. All right, so now while this condition is true, we want to create a text view and set the text to be the word at the current index in the words list. And then we need it to display the text views on the screen. So since I already have the code for this, let's move it into the while statement. So this will take the place of the instructions. Nice, so it looks like we're almost done with our while loop. Last thing we need to do here is to update the counter variable. Remember that we need to update the counter variable at the end of each iteration so that we can exit the loop when we've reached the end of the list. So using the shorthand that we learned earlier, I'm going to type in index plus plus. And remember, this is a shorthand that's equivalent to index equals index plus 1. So I'll just make a comment of that off to the side to help you guys remember that. So now I can go ahead and remove the rest of this code. I don't need it anymore since the while loop does all of that. All right, so we just made a number of changes to our code and implemented a brand new concept, the while loop. So to recap what we just did, remember that we removed the log messages in the numbers activity onCreate method. We also modified the activity_numbers.xml, changed it to use a linear layout instead of a relative layout. We set the orientation to be vertical, and then we added a view ID called root view. And lastly, in the onCreate method of the numbers activity, We use the 3 guiding questions to help us write a while loop to create and display a text view for each element in the words list. All right, so earlier we talked a little bit about counter shorthands, and one common one that we saw was the index plus plus that we used in the while loop. And I mentioned that it was shorthand for index equals index plus 1. There are a number of other similar math shorthands. For example, a variable maybe such as j plus or equals a number, so 3 in this case, and that's a shorthand for that variable is assigned that variable plus that number. Additionally, we can have subtraction shorthands, such as taking a variable and then add minus minus, and this is shorthand for I equals I minus 1. And remember, in all these cases, we can substitute different variables and different numbers. It's also really important to notice that I plus plus is not just equal to the I plus 1 part, but it equals the entire expression I equals I plus 1. So doing the calculation and then assigning it back to that variable.